The day had been long in the small, dusty town. The air was heavy with heat, and dust floated in the wind, making the marketplace feel even more restless. It was the day of the auction, the day when traders, farmers, and strangers gathered to bargain for animals, tools, and sometimes people who were treated as if they were nothing more than property. The shouts of men, the laughter of others, and the constant sound of coins being exchanged filled the air. Everyone wanted something valuable, something they could take home and use. The auctioneer stood on a raised wooden platform. His voice was rough from calling out all day, but he pushed through, determined to finish. One by one, strong men had been sold. Women with bright eyes and steady hands had been taken away. Even young boys were bought quickly by farmers who needed help with their land. By the late afternoon, most of the crowd was tired, but their excitement remained high. They still hoped for one last treasure before the auction ended. And then, as the sun dipped lower and cast long shadows across the ground, a figure was brought forward. She was a woman, but not like the others who had been auctioned earlier. Her body carried marks of hardship. Her dress was torn in places, her face pale, her hair tangled. She walked slowly, her steps heavy as if each one carried the weight of her painful past. Her wrists showed bruises, and a faint limp made her look even weaker. The crowd grew silent at first. They studied her, waiting for the auctioneer to announce her worth. But instead of quick excitement, there were murmurs of doubt. A few men laughed under their breath. "She looks broken," one whispered. Another muttered, "No use for her, not even for work." The auctioneer cleared his throat and raised his hand. "Here we have one more, a woman. Strong once, still alive, still standing. Who will start the bidding?" His words tried to add weight to her presence, but the crowd was not moved. Silence stretched across the square. People shuffled their feet, looked at each other, and then turned their heads away. No hands went up, no voices called out. For the first time that day, no one wanted what was offered. The woman kept her head lowered. She could hear their whispers, feel their rejection. Every cruel word was like a stone thrown at her heart. She had known pain before, but this moment felt like the sharpest wound. To be unwanted, even when standing in front of people who had paid for less, broke something inside her. She clenched her hands tightly, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. The auctioneer tried again. "Someone must see value here. Who will give me something? A small price?" His voice grew desperate because an item unsold made him look weak. But the people only laughed louder. "Not worth a coin," someone shouted from the back. It seemed certain the auction would end with her standing there, rejected and humiliated in front of everyone. The woman felt her knees weaken, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. She wished the ground would open and swallow her whole so she would not have to hear another cruel laugh or see another disgusted face. And then it happened. A single voice rose above the crowd, calm but firm. "I'll pay for her." The auctioneer froze, his eyes wide. The crowd turned at once, trying to see who had spoken. At the far edge of the gathering stood a man. His hat shaded his face, but his posture was tall, steady, and unshaken by the attention suddenly turned on him. He wore simple clothes, dusty from travel, and heavy boots that showed he had walked many miles. The crowd erupted in whispers. "Is he mad?" someone asked. "Why waste money on her?" another said. They could not understand. All day they had judged worth by strength, beauty, and skill. To them, she had none of these left, but the man did not care for their opinions. He walked forward slowly, each step measured, his eyes fixed not on the crowd but on the woman. When he reached the platform, he placed a small bag of coins in the auctioneer's hand. "This will do," he said simply. The auctioneer, too surprised to argue, nodded quickly and announced, "Sold." The word rang across the square, silencing the laughter for a brief moment. The people stared, some shaking their heads, others smiling with mockery. To them, this stranger had made a foolish choice. The woman, still standing on the platform, lifted her eyes at last. She expected cruelty in his expression, the same kind she had seen too many times before. But instead, she saw something different. His face was calm, his gaze steady. Not filled with pity, not filled with judgment, but something she could not yet name. Her heart raced. Why would anyone choose her? Why would anyone pay for someone the world had already thrown away? The man stepped closer and held out his hand, not in command, but in quiet invitation. She hesitated, fear twisting inside her chest. Every instinct told her to resist, to run if she could. Yet there was no threat in his voice, no harshness in his movements. Slowly, Almost against her will, she placed her trembling hand in his. The crowd broke into laughter again, mocking both of them now. "A fool and his broken prize," someone shouted. But the man ignored every voice. He guided her gently off the platform, shielding her from the stares with the quiet strength of his presence. As they walked away from the square, the woman could hear the jeers fading behind them. But inside her thoughts were louder. Who was he? Why had he done this? What would he want in return? She had learned long ago that nothing in life was given freely. Kindness always carried a price, and she feared what his might be. Still, there was something about the way he held her hand, firm but not harsh, steady but not forceful. That gave her the smallest spark of hope. A spark so small she almost didn't recognize it. The marketplace returned to its noise behind them, but for the woman, time seemed to slow. She was no longer standing before a crowd that rejected her. She was walking beside a man whose choice had changed everything. She did not know if it was for better or worse, but for the first time in a long time, her story was moving forward. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with deep colors of orange and gold. The town slowly disappeared behind them as they stepped onto the road leading out. Each step away from that place felt like a step away from the pain and shame of the day. She did not know where he was taking her or why he had chosen her when no one else would. But deep inside, a question echoed again and again. Why me? And though she could not yet find an answer, she held on to the quiet truth that the auction had ended, but her life had not. A stranger's voice had changed her fate. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to his choice than she could yet understand. The road stretched endlessly before them as the man guided her away from the noisy town. The dust swirled under their feet, and the sound of the crowd's laughter faded slowly behind them. The woman's heart was beating fast, not from the pace of their walk, but from the storm of thoughts racing in her mind. She had expected to be abandoned, left on that wooden platform like a forgotten object. Yet this man had paid for her when no one else even looked at her twice. She could not understand his reason. The man walked quietly, not speaking much, and that silence made her uneasy. She kept stealing quick glances at him, trying to guess what kind of person he was. His clothes were simple, worn from travel, but they were neat. His boots looked heavy, the kind only a man used to long journeys would wear. His shoulders were broad, his stride steady, and he carried himself with the calmness of someone who knew his own strength. But what unsettled her most was his face. It was not cruel. It did not twist with greed or impatience the way she had seen in others before. His face was calm, thoughtful, and strangely kind. Finally, he stopped under the shade of an old oak tree near the edge of the road. He reached into the small pack slung across his back and brought out a flask of water. Without saying a word, he handed it to her. She hesitated, staring at it with suspicion. Kindness always hid a demand. She had learned that lesson too many times. "Drink," he said softly, his voice steady but not forceful. Her dry throat ached, but her fear held her back. What if it was a trick? What if his patience was only a mask? She looked into his eyes, searching for something she could trust. All she saw was calmness and something deeper she could not name. Slowly, with trembling hands, she accepted the flask and took a small sip. The water was cool and refreshing, easing the dryness in her throat. She drank a little more, then handed it back quickly, as if holding it longer might anger him. "Keep it," he said. "You need it more than I do." Her eyes widened. She clutched the flask tightly against her chest, her mind struggling to believe his words. He gave without asking anything in return. She almost whispered a thank you, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Gratitude was dangerous. It could make her hope, and hope had always betrayed her. They walked again, the silence stretching between them. She wanted to ask him questions, but fear kept her quiet. Instead, her mind filled the space with doubt. Why had he chosen her? What did he see in her when everyone else saw only weakness? What would he demand of her when they reached wherever he was leading her? As the sun began to lower, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink, they reached a small rise in the land. Below it lay a plain with scattered patches of grass, and in the distance the faint outline of a house and a barn. Smoke rose gently from a chimney, a sign of warmth and life. The man pointed ahead. "That's my place," he said simply. His place? She had not expected that. She thought he might deliver her to another town, sell her again, or use her for some hidden purpose. The idea that he was taking her to his home made her tense. She slowed her steps, uncertain whether to continue. He noticed and stopped, turning toward her. "You don't have to fear me," he said in the same calm tone. "No harm will come to you with me." Her heart pounded at his words. They sounded honest, but honesty was something she had rarely known. She looked at him carefully, trying to see if his eyes betrayed any hidden meaning. Yet again she found nothing but quiet steadiness. Reluctantly, she followed him down the slope. The house grew clearer as they approached. It was not grand, not like the houses of wealthy men in town. It was simple, built of wood, its paint faded by years of weather. The barn beside it stood strong, with horses tied near the fence. The sight of animals grazing peacefully brought her an unexpected comfort. When they reached the porch, he opened the door and motioned for her to step inside. She hesitated once more, her body stiff, her mind screaming warnings. But something stronger than her fear guided her feet, and she stepped into the house. The air inside was warm and smelled faintly of firewood and bread. A simple table stood near the center, with 2 chairs beside it. A shelf lined with a few books and jars leaned against the wall. The place was not rich, but it felt alive, cared for, lived in. "You can rest here," he said, pointing to a small bed in the corner. "You look like you haven't had proper rest in a long while." She looked at the bed, then back at him. Suspicion gnawed at her heart again. No one had ever offered her rest without demanding something in return. She shook her head slightly, backing away a step. He didn't press her. Instead, he walked to the fireplace and added wood to the flames. The fire crackled, filling the silence with warmth. Then he sat at the table, took out a loaf of bread from a cloth sack and placed it between them. "Eat," he said gently. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but pride and fear battled within her. She had been given food before, but always at a price she wished she had never paid. She stood frozen, uncertain. He broke the bread himself, placing a piece on the table closer to her. Then he leaned back, eating his share without another word. The quiet way he ate, without pushing her, slowly eased her fear. After a long moment, she stepped closer, picked up the bread, and took a small bite. It was soft, filling, and the taste brought tears to her eyes. She chewed slowly, her chest tightening. For so long, she had been treated as less than human. Now, sitting across from this man who had chosen her when no one else would, she felt something she had almost forgotten: dignity. The evening passed in silence. When she finished her bread, he collected the crumbs, cleaned the table, and prepared a blanket near the fire. "You can rest here tonight," he said. "You'll be safe, safe." The word echoed in her mind like a forgotten song. Could it be true? She curled up under the blanket, watching him quietly as he sat near the window, staring out at the night sky. His presence filled the room with a sense of calm she had never known. As her eyes grew heavy, her mind still wrestled with questions. Who was he? Why had he chosen her? What did he want? But sleep, for the first time in many nights, came without fear. She drifted off to the crackle of firewood, the steady sound of the wind outside, and the quiet comfort of knowing that, at least for now, she was not alone. And though she did not yet understand his reasons, she began to feel a small shift inside her, a fragile thread of trust forming in her heart, fragile but real. The morning light crept through the small window, filling the room with a soft glow. The woman opened her eyes slowly, unsure for a moment where she was. For so long she had woken in places of darkness, in corners where no comfort existed, but now she found herself under a blanket, near a warm fire that still whispered with faint crackles. For a moment she wondered if it was a dream. But then she heard movement, the sound of boots on wooden floorboards. The man was already awake. He moved with steady purpose, placing a kettle over the fire, preparing for the day. He glanced at her only briefly, not with command or ownership, but with quiet acknowledgement. "You slept," he said calmly, as though sleep itself was a gift she had been denied for too long. She pushed herself up slowly, her body still sore from past wounds. "Yes," she whispered, her voice rough, uncertain. "Good," he replied, pouring hot water into a cup. "You'll need strength. Healing takes time." The words lingered with her, healing. She had never thought of herself in that way. People before had only seen her as broken, as a burden, but here was a man who spoke of her as if she still had something left worth saving. He placed a piece of bread and a cup of warm drink before her on the table. Again she hesitated, but hunger pushed her forward. She ate slowly, watching him from the corner of her eye. He did not rush her, did not press her for words. He simply let the silence rest between them, a silence that somehow felt safe rather than heavy. When she finished, he stood. "I'll tend to the horses," he said. "You can rest or walk outside if you like. The air will do you good." He stepped out, leaving her alone. She sat still for a long while, her hands resting on the table. Part of her wanted to run, escape before he could change his mind, before he could reveal demands hidden behind his kindness. But where would she go? Back to the cruel streets of town, back to faces that mocked her and hands that hurt her? Her eyes drifted to the window. She could see him outside, moving easily among the animals. The horses lifted their heads at his approach, calm and trusting. He stroked their necks, spoke to them in low tones, and worked with steady hands. She watched quietly, struck by the gentleness of a man who clearly had strength to spare. Finally, curiosity drew her out. She stepped onto the porch, the morning air cool against her skin. He glanced at her, gave a small nod, but said nothing. That small gesture felt like permission to breathe freely. She walked slowly toward the fence, keeping distance but watching him work. "You've cared for horses before?" he asked, suddenly surprising her. She shook her head quickly. "No." "Then you'll learn," he said simply, as if the choice was hers. "They're good creatures. They'll trust you if you treat them right." The idea startled her. Trust? She had almost forgotten what that meant. Over the next few days, life fell into a rhythm. He tended the ranch with steady patience, and she found herself slowly drawn into helping. At first, she did small things, carrying water, gathering firewood, sweeping the porch. Each time she expected him to scold her or demand perfection, but he never did. Instead, he thanked her with quiet words that carried more weight than she realized. Her body began to heal, the bruises fading, her strength returning. But it was her spirit that felt the strangest change. For the first time in years, no one raised a hand against her. No one shouted at her. Instead, she was given space, safety, and quiet respect. One evening, as they sat near the fire, he finally spoke more than a few words. "You don't have to tell me your story," he said, his voice steady. "But if you ever want to, I'll listen." Her chest tightened. The offer was gentle, not forced. For a long moment she said nothing, staring into the flames, but then words began to slip out, hesitant and quiet, as if pulled from a locked place in her heart. She told him pieces. How betrayal had led her to cruel hands, how promises had been broken, how pain had become her daily companion. She did not tell everything, not yet, but enough that he would know the weight she carried. He listened without interruption, without judgment. When she finally stopped, her voice trembling, he only nodded. "You've carried much," he said softly, "but it doesn't have to define you." The words struck her deeply. Could she really be more than the pain she had endured? Could she have a life beyond the scars? She wanted to believe him, but fear still clung tightly. The next days tested her trust further. One morning she tried to lift a heavy bucket and her strength failed. The water spilled, soaking the ground. She froze, expecting anger. But instead he only smiled faintly and said, "It happens. Try again when you're ready." His patience stunned her. She had known only harshness for mistakes, but here mistakes were not punished, they were simply part of learning. Each small act of kindness chipped away at the walls around her heart. She found herself watching him more closely, noticing how he worked with quiet determination, how he treated every creature with care, how he never once looked at her with pity. At night, when she lay under the blanket, she thought of his words, "It doesn't have to define you." The thought wrapped around her like the warmth of the fire, fragile but comforting. Slowly, she began to change. She laughed once, a small sound that surprised even her. He looked at her then, not with shock but with quiet satisfaction, as though he had been waiting for that moment. One afternoon, as they walked together across the field, she dared to ask, "Why did you choose me that day, when no one else would?" He was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Because worth is not decided by a crowd," he said at last. "I saw someone who had more strength than she realized, someone who deserved a chance." His answer left her speechless. She lowered her eyes, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. No one had ever spoken of her in such a way. The days stretched into weeks, and with each sunrise, her trust grew a little stronger. She was not healed fully. Her fears still whispered, her doubts still clung. But she was no longer the broken figure left unwanted at the auction. She was a woman learning to stand again, guided by the quiet strength of a man who saw her not as a burden, but as a person. And though she could not yet name the bond forming between them, she felt it in every act of kindness, every word of patience, every glance that carried respect rather than judgment. Healing, she realized, was not only about the body. It was about finding a place where one's spirit could breathe again. And slowly, under his roof and by his side, she began to believe she might find that place at last. The weeks passed, and life on the ranch found its rhythm. The woman, once too weak to lift even a bucket, now carried water with steady hands. She moved with more confidence, though her steps were still careful. The man never rushed her. He taught her slowly, showing her how to feed the horses, mend a broken fence, and even grind grain for bread. Each lesson was offered with patience, never pressure. She was learning not only the work of the ranch but also something far greater, the feeling of being trusted. But outside their quiet home, whispers spread across the town. People could not forget the auction, nor the man's strange choice. Some mocked him openly, calling him a fool who had wasted his money. Others gossiped in secret, inventing reasons why he had taken her in. Rumors grew, each one crueler than the last. Yet he paid no attention to them. His focus stayed on the work of his hands and the quiet healing of the woman who now shared his days. Still, she was not blind. When she went with him into town once for supplies, she heard the whispers herself. Eyes followed her, some filled with scorn, others with pity. Laughter trailed after them like shadows. She lowered her head, shame burning her cheeks. She wished she could disappear, but the man's presence beside her was steady. He did not quicken his step or tighten his jaw. He did not return their stares. He simply carried the supplies, paid the merchant, and walked calmly back toward the road that led home. His silence spoke louder than words. The opinions of the crowd meant nothing, yet the whispers reached darker ears. One evening, as the sky turned purple and the first stars appeared, trouble came. The sound of hooves broke the peaceful quiet of the ranch. She stepped onto the porch and froze as 3 riders approached. Their faces were familiar, cruel shadows from her past. Men who had once claimed power over her, who had treated her like an object, who now sneered as if they had found lost property. "Well, well," one of them called, dismounting with a smirk. "Look who's here. Thought you could run, did you?" Her body trembled. The ground felt unsteady beneath her feet. She wanted to retreat inside, but fear pinned her in place. The man stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. He looked at the riders calmly, his eyes steady. "You're on my land," he said, his voice even. "She belongs to us," the second man spat, pointing toward her. "Hand her over, and we'll leave peaceful." The woman's breath caught in her throat. Old terror rose like a storm inside her. For years she had known no one would protect her, no one would stand against these men. Her heart sank, expecting betrayal even here. But the man did not move aside. He stepped closer instead, placing himself between her and them. "She belongs to no one," he said firmly, "least of all to the likes of you." The leader's smile faded into a scowl. "You think you can stand against us? 3 against 1? I don't think," the man replied quietly. "I know." The riders exchanged uneasy glances. Something in his voice and the calm certainty of his stance unsettled them. He did not raise his voice, did not brandish a weapon, but strength radiated from him like the steady weight of stone. The leader tried again, his voice sharp with anger. "This isn't over. You can't keep her hidden forever. She'll come back one way or another." The man's eyes hardened. "You'll never touch her again. Leave now." For a tense moment, the night held its breath. The horses stamped their hooves, sensing the tension. The men shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was no ordinary rancher. At last, with curses under their breath, they pulled on their reins and turned their horses. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only silence. The woman stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. She could hardly believe what she had witnessed. Someone had faced them for her. Someone had not turned away in fear or disgust. The man turned to her slowly, his expression softening. "You're safe," he said gently. Tears blurred her vision. For so long she had carried the weight of being unwanted, unprotected. Now, for the first time, someone had stood between her and her fears. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto the porch steps, covering her face with trembling hands. He did not rush to comfort her. He simply sat beside her close enough that she could feel his steady presence. His silence told her that she could cry if she needed, that he would not think her weak for it. That night, sleep came slowly. Every sound of the wind outside made her tense, fearing the rider's return. But each time she opened her eyes, she saw him sitting near the window, his rifle resting within reach, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. He did not sleep, not until he was sure she could rest. The next morning, she rose with heavy eyes. He was already outside, working as though nothing had happened. She stepped toward him, her voice shaking. "Why?" He paused, leaning on the fence. "Why what? Why did you stand for me?" She whispered. "They could have hurt you. You could have let them take me. No one would have blamed you." He looked at her, his eyes calm but steady. "Because you're worth protecting," he said simply. Her breath caught. The words wrapped around her heart like a balm on an old wound. Worth protecting. She repeated the phrase in her mind again and again, unable to believe it yet, unable to let it go. Days passed and the riders did not return, but their shadow lingered. She found herself more aware of every kindness he showed, every moment of patience, every quiet act of respect. The fear inside her began to loosen its grip, replaced by something unfamiliar but powerful. Hope. When she walked through the fields now, she no longer felt invisible. When she carried water to the horses, she no longer felt useless. Each small task was a reminder that she was part of something, that she was not just a shadow to be discarded. And slowly, though she could not yet name it, she began to feel something more. It stirred in her chest when she caught him looking at the horizon with quiet thought, when he spoke words that carried weight without needing force, when he offered her safety without asking for anything in return. The world might have doubted him, mocked him, whispered cruel words, but she was living proof of his choice. He had seen worth in her when no one else had. He had faced her past so that she might have a future. And in the quiet of the ranch, beneath the wide-open sky, she began to believe that perhaps her life was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she was slowly being given: dignity, safety, and the fragile but growing seed of trust. The days on the ranch grew brighter, not only because of the sun that climbed over the hills each morning, but also because of the change slowly blooming within the woman. Each day she found herself stronger, more capable, and more certain of her place in this small world she had once feared would reject her forever. The man, steady as the mountain surrounding the ranch, continued to guide her with patience and quiet encouragement. He never forced her, never judged her, and never reminded her of the life she had endured before he had arrived. Slowly, she learned to see herself not as broken, but as someone who could still grow, still thrive. Her mornings began with tending the animals, a task she had once thought impossible. Horses nuzzled her hand, chickens followed her quietly, and even the dogs, initially wary of strangers, warmed to her presence. The work was hard, the sun beating down on her back, the chores endless, yet she felt alive in a way she had never known. She had once felt trapped in a world that offered nothing but pain. Now each step across the fields, each act of care for the animals, reminded her that she could contribute, that she could matter. The man watched her quietly from time to time, his eyes reflecting pride but not in a boastful way. It was the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen potential where no one else had looked, someone who had chosen to believe when all others had turned away. Sometimes he spoke, offering gentle advice or a small piece of encouragement. Other times he simply nodded, letting her find her rhythm in her own way. Word of her transformation slowly spread across the nearby towns. At first it was whispers and skeptical laughter. "The man who took in that woman," they said. "She will never be more than what she was." But soon those whispers changed. People began to notice her strength, the way she moved with confidence, the way her eyes no longer carried fear but determination. Even the most skeptical townsfolk could not deny the change. One afternoon, she and the man walked along the ridge above the ranch, looking down at the fields below. The wind carried the scent of grass and earth, the gentle rustle of trees blending with the distant sounds of animals. She stopped and turned toward him, uncertainty in her eyes. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Taking me in, paying for me when no one else would?" He looked at her, a small smile brushing his lips. "Never," he said simply. "Not for a single moment. I saw something in you that no one else could see. And now look at what you have become." Her chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and disbelief flooding her. She had learned to trust him, yet even now his words felt almost too kind, almost too real. She realized then that trust was not just about believing he would not harm her. It was about believing that she deserved the care and respect he had shown her all along. Time passed, and with it came the quiet comfort of routine and the gentle growth of companionship. The woman began to help with more than just chores. She cooked meals, tended the garden, and learned to care for the land itself. Each act of contribution reinforced her sense of worth. She laughed more, her smiles becoming frequent and genuine, and with each passing day the bond between her and the man strengthened, not forced, not hurried, but natural, growing quietly like the plants in the garden she tended. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with warm shades of gold and pink, she stood on the porch and watched him work with the horses. The horses responded to his calm authority, moving with precision and grace under his hands. She felt a sudden surge of admiration, not just for his strength but for his character. The steady patience, the unwavering integrity, the gentle way he treated her and every living thing on the ranch. She realized with a quiet awe that this man had given her something more valuable than safety or shelter. He had given her a new life, one in which she could finally see her own potential. Her thoughts were interrupted when he approached, carrying a small bucket of fresh water. He handed it to her with a smile. "You've done well today," he said simply. "The ranch is better with your hands and your care." She felt her cheeks warm at his praise, something she had rarely experienced in her life. Most people had only seen her weakness, only focused on her past, never on the present or what she could achieve. But here she felt seen, truly seen, for the first time. Days turned into weeks, and the woman found herself embracing life in ways she had never imagined. She explored the fields alone, walked along the edges of the property, and even helped the man with repairs to the barn. Each task was a lesson in trust, not only in him but in herself. She learned that she could make decisions, take action, and handle responsibility. The fear that had once defined her life began to fade, replaced by confidence and quiet strength. One day, as they worked together to repair a fence, she finally asked the question that had lingered in her mind for weeks. "Why me?" she asked softly. "Why did you pay for me that day at the auction when no one else would?" He paused, leaning on the fence post, and looked at her. "Because I saw something in you," he said simply. "Something that others overlooked. Strength, courage, and the potential to grow. You were not broken in the way they thought, you were simply unseen." Her eyes filled with tears. For so long she had been unseen, unwanted, and unloved. Now, for the first time, someone had recognized her worth without expecting anything in return. The realization was overwhelming, and she felt a surge of gratitude that went deeper than words could express. As the seasons changed, so did her life. She planted flowers near the porch, watched them bloom, and learned to take pride in her accomplishments. The man, who had once been a stranger, became a constant presence, a steady companion in the quiet rhythms of ranch life. Their bond grew stronger each day, built on trust, respect, and shared experience. Neighbors and townsfolk began to see the change as well. The woman who had once been abandoned, mocked, and left for last was now recognized for her strength and resilience. Some came to learn from her, some came to admire her courage, and all saw the transformation that had taken place under the quiet guidance of the man who had chosen her. One evening, as they watched the sun set from the porch, she leaned slightly against him, feeling the steady warmth of his presence. "I never imagined life could be like this," she whispered. He smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "It can," he said simply. "Life is not about the pain we have endured, but about the choices we make and the people who believe in us." For the first time in her life, she felt complete. Not because the past had been erased, but because she had found a future filled with hope, trust, and belonging. The woman who had once been wounded and beaten, left behind at the auction, now stood tall, her heart open, her spirit strong, and in the quiet of the ranch under the wide, endless sky, she realized that she had been given more than shelter or protection. She had been given a life where she mattered, a life where her worth was recognized, and a future where she could be free. The man beside her had not only saved her from the cruelty of others, he had shown her the true meaning of compassion, patience, and respect. Together they looked toward the horizon, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the past no longer defined them. Her story, once marked by rejection and despair, had transformed into one of hope, resilience, and new beginnings. And as she took the man's hand in hers, she knew that the life they would build together would be guided by kindness, courage, and the unwavering belief that everyone, no matter their past, could rise from the ashes and embrace the life they truly deserved.